from 7 regional areas across the state to determine what it was that we as a state wanted to do with regard to our standards. They looked, for example, line by line at our previous standards and the standards that were being developed across most of the country. They considered them in terms of rigor and they're being developmentally appropriate. And at the end of that year of work, there were promulgated regulations to change our English language arts and math standards. Those regulations were out for an extended period of public comment for 6 months. They went out in December 2011. Between that time and their being approved by the state board, there were community meetings held across the state, and the result, and of course lots of public comment that did result in some revisions to the standards that were approved. And the end of those 2 years of work were a new set of English language arts and math standards, which were adopted in 2012. So as Deputy Commissioner Morris has already stated, the connection to the waiver is that there are 3 principles in the waiver that are required, one of which is the adoption of what are called college and career-ready standards in minimally language arts and math, following whatever a state's adoption process is. The other component is that each state was required to provide assurance from the state university that the standards would result in students not needing remedial coursework at the post-secondary level. So there was an analysis of our standards done by the University of Alaska system and a written assurance that their impression was that if students met those standards, that would mitigate the need for remediation in college in Alaska. So because our standards met the criteria for being college and career ready, and because we had that assurance from the university, we knew that we would, at least with regard to that principle, be eligible for a waiver. We were already out in front with that work, and it coincided nicely with the first principle required for the waiver. So I'll just pause there for a moment before we move into assessment.
Does the committee have any questions about the standards? I guess I have one. Why are we just doing, I mean, since we're doing it on our own, why are we just doing English and math?
Well, we have other content standards. We have content standards in history and geography and science, government and citizenship. We actually have content standards in all of those areas, and we have performance standards in science and history as well. So it's, English language arts and math, our standards there were, I think they had been developed in 2006. A lot has happened in education since that time. A lot of information around remediation rates post-secondary, specifically connected to kids' abilities and skills in English language arts and math. And so those were perceived as the standards most needing a fresh look. Now, there's a phrase that I use when I talk with folks around the state is that our standards, our grade level expectations were first generation standards. They were certainly better than the no grade level standards that we had before that. But it was really our first take as a state on developing standards to guide districts and schools. And so it was time for a revision in light of all that we know about student achievement and what it takes to be successful in the workplace and post-secondary.
If I could add to that, the other piece is the reading, writing, and mathematics are the 3 areas that state statute, even if the federal statute went away, the state statute says we will have standards in and we will test in those areas. We also test in science, but state statute doesn't mandate that. Federal statute does mandate that. So we decided even if we weren't doing the waiver, these are the areas we test in because the state statute requires that. So that's where we're going to put our energy first. Obviously, we probably want to update science at some point, but let's focus on the areas absolutely mandated by the state.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Representative Wilson.
Just to repeat, what does the statute say that the state has to test on?
The state statute says that we need to have standards in reading, writing, and mathematics, and have a comprehensive system of student assessment around those areas.
Thank you.
Representative Reinbold?
Okay. Basically what my question is I know these are more rigorous standards, and I want to know how many teachers were involved in putting these standards into place, and were they selectively invited, or was it across the board invitation? And then I've got a follow-up through the chair.
The majority of the 229 stakeholders involved were classroom teachers. There were representatives from post-secondary, from career and technical education, from business and industry, but the vast majority, certainly could get you the exact number, the vast majority were classroom teachers.
Okay, that would be great, because I'm getting a lot of questions asked, who was part of this, how come I wasn't, it's just nice to be able to say, hey, these are the people involved. If you have questions, you can go talk to them. As in a follow-up through the chair, I would want to know the cost of these more rigorous. Do you have an estimate on the cost of implementation of these new standards, and in particular the curriculum? And I want to also validate that at the local level, let's say like the Anchorage School District, is going to be able to choose the curriculum. It's not going to be a federalized curriculum. Is that correct?
Yeah, through the chair, Representative Reinbold, there have been no requests from the department for increased funding to implement the standards. We have been doing, as a department, professional development and providing technical assistance around standards implementation with our previous standards. It is those funds that we are using to assist people in moving toward implementation of the new standards. So there haven't been any increased costs. Districts, for example, are required to have a 6-year curriculum review cycle where at least once every 6 years, every content area is reviewed. So they are using their curriculum review cycles, which are required by regulation, now to do the work necessary to ensure alignment of curriculum and materials with the new standards. So with regard to the ability of districts to select curriculum, that is clearly indicated in regulation. It assigns responsibility for the development of reading, writing, and math standards, as Deputy Commissioner Moore said, to the department, and assigns responsibility for the development of curriculum and the selection of materials aligned to those standards to district, not to the department.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot from our constituents about the Common Core, and that we basically have adopted the Common Core because so much of the Alaska standards. So if we had actually adopted the Common Core, like many other states, how would that have been different than what we did by doing a few changes and calling them the Alaska standards?
I think, Representative Wilson, it's different on both the front end and then the back end, so to speak, of the standards development process. On the front end, had we adopted the Common Core standards, we wouldn't have likely convened 229 educators from across the state to go line by line through the standards to determine that, yes, for example, we like the wording of this Common Core standard, but we want to add clarity, like the words with scaffolding and support, which was added to quite a few of our elementary literacy standards. We wouldn't have engaged them in conversation around what to do with elementary measurement standards, 18 or so of which are in our standards that are not in the Common Core. So the process that we went through, talking with stakeholders, having them compare our previous GLEs to the Common Core standards, and determining what to do standard by standard, we likely wouldn't have done that. We would have said we're adopting the Common Core standards. That's not what we did. On the back end, so to speak, adopting the Common Core standards restricts the state's ability to make changes to them. And something that might seem incidental in way of a change isn't incidental with regard to adopting the Common Core. Even adding words like with scaffolding and support, that's a change. And so the rules, so to speak, around adopting the Common Core were that they needed to be adopted in their entirety, and states could add up to 15% more of their own standards. And we didn't want to do that on the front end. And on the back end, now that we've adopted our standards, we want to be free to change whatever we want to change through the standard development processes outlined in regulations.
Representative Gaddis.
So just to be real clear, and clear to any of the folks that, oh, excuse me,
My house, we forget. And so just to be real clear, and for those listening in or who might listen later, what I think I'm hearing, and please correct me, is that there were a host of teachers from around the state and other folks, but a lot of teachers, that line item by line item, and if you will, looked at the Common Core standards and said pretty much, yes, that one, we can live with that. You know, I don't like this wording, but all in all, the standard itself, yeah, we can live with. Let's change this, squidge a little bit. And then more importantly, they went through each and every one and said, you know, this appeals, this is what we're all about, and this is a higher rigor than what we're doing now.
Right.
That being said, the state of Alaska has also chosen that as we go through this and down the road, that we also have an opportunity to make changes as we go along as well. So front end, people looked at it and really went through it. Bottom line is, where I get some grief is like, hey, we're not calling them Common Core, but they pretty much align themselves with the Common Core and the standards. And I think that what you're saying, that's pretty much where we started, is looking at those Common Core standards. What are the parts that you like about it? What are the parts you don't like about it? Let's discuss the ones we don't, and let's change them so we can all agree. Is that pretty much what happened? So that's why it's aligned, and that's why pretty much we can get caught up in the semantics of Common Core assessments or curriculum over on another side, but we've pretty much adopted the Common Core standards, having looked at them line item by line item, and the parts that we didn't agree with, we did make those changes, the standards. And I guess what I'm saying is, I hear a lot of folks get caught up in the standards when really they really mean to talk about assessments and or the curriculum. So, I mean, I guess I'm hearing saying that we pretty much adopted the Common Core standards with some slight variation, and our teachers from Alaska throughout have really line item by line item checked those standards out.
Representative Gaddis, I think that, let's just see how to respond. What we've heard as essential is our state's right to do whatever our state wants to do with its standards. And so anytime we say we adopted the Common Core, there is an element of that is connected to giving up our rights to do what we want to do with our standards. And unequivocally, we did not do that, and we don't want to do that. Now, when one compares our standards with the Common Core standards, if we go to third grade math, for example, and look to see what kids are doing with multiplication facts, they are going to be Alaska third grade math standard, Common Core third grade math standard, individual standard, identical. Next standard, identical. Next standard, changed it up a little bit with some additional wording for clarity. So it's a tricky nuance in that we want to be very clear that we did not and we do not want to give up our right to do what we want. And the phrase adopted the Common Core implies a giving up of that right. So if we're talking about the standards themselves, grade by grade, and their degree of similarity to the Common Core, they are very similar standards with some language added in some cases for clarification, with some additional standards added in that Alaskans wanted retained that are not in the Common Core standards.
And if I might just follow up, thank you, that was very well said, and that's what I want. And I'll admit that there's a lot of folks that are really pushing back against Common Core. They pretty much agree, and if they're listening or going to listen, they've agreed that the standards are far more rigorous. They've not found anything within the standards that they really have a problem with. So I guess I just really wanted to make sure, and you did a great job of separating the Common Core issues that people are fighting from actually what Alaska did and what Alaska is still allowed to do. And I think that's very, very important, so I thank you.
Representative Drummond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. McCauley. A few minutes ago, you mentioned that if Alaska had adopted the Common Core standards whole cloth, that would have restricted our ability to make changes beyond 15%. Would you say there's a percentage difference? Can you say that the standards that we adopted are, say, 65% different from the Common Core standards? Is there a way to assess them, the changes that were made, or that the new standards that were introduced on Alaska's behalf differ from the Common Core standards?
Yeah, through the chair, Representative Drummond, my understanding is that it wasn't that the rules around the adoption of Common Core were not that a state could change 15%, it was that they could add 15% and could change 0%. If we are constituting, the addition of clarifying language is a change, and certainly the addition of a standard that's not in the Common Core is a change. Our standards are probably about 90% similar to the Common Core standards. If we compare every grade, K-12, every standard, we are probably talking about 90% similar. But that would not have been permitted had we adopted the Common Core. It wasn't 15% change, it was no change, addition of 15%. So even that little bit of difference, which actually wasn't a little bit to Alaskan educators, when we're talking about clarifying language on a literature standard that talks about culturally relevant reading materials, that's not a small thing to Alaskan educators. When we're talking about, as I've already said, a third grade standard around a reading skill and the words with scaffolding or support, a child will do this with scaffolding or support, that is not a small change to Alaskan educators. Those changes would not have been permitted.
Thank you.
Representative Josephson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. McCauley, I guess I'm a little, I'm far from an expert on Common Core. I got some sense that someone in the education community thought I was. I'm definitely not. But I looked at it a little bit online. It appears to be not a federal program, but a governor's organization, in part. It's not something the federal government created or is pushing, as I understand it. And it's also voluntary. And I'm just curious about what, if you could describe, and I really am expressing some ignorance of this, what is the national obsession about Common Core? Are we feeling pressure to join from our sister states? Why are we so focused on this? Why do we care?
Through the chair, Representative Josephson, there were two organizations that were the leading organizations around the development of the Common Core state standards. The Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSSO, and the National Governors Association. That was a bipartisan effort, not driven by the federal government, regarding the development of the Common Core standards. So your statement was correct. Where things seem to have shifted a bit is when the language around the adoption of college and career-ready standards was included as one of the conditions of the ESEA waiver, then connecting that language, college and career-ready, to federal government through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And the best that I've been able to make sense of this is that is when what was a bipartisan, non-federally driven effort became then connected to the federal government. The adoption of the Common Core standards are entirely voluntary. We've not felt at any point any pressure to do that. We don't now feel any pressure to do that. We are not the only state to have not adopted the Common Core standards and to have received an ESEA waiver. There is one other. There are 2 other states whose waivers are currently in review who have not adopted the Common Core standards. So my sense of it is a real resistance to and concern about anything that approaches what we're all hearing about, federal overreach of the federal government into education in the state of Alaska. And what we're trying to explain is, again, that both on the front end of what we've done and on the back end now of what we are able to do at any point, that has not, in our view, occurred. We were already out in front on 2 of the 3 required elements for that waiver. We would have done them with or without the waiver. The standards were adopted prior to our applying. They allowed us to, they made it likely we would qualify for the waiver, but our doing them was not with a pressure or because of the waiver. That's, I don't know if I've answered your question. I'll just stop, and if I haven't, then I'll attempt to do so.
Just a quick follow-up. I'm not sure. I think you explained it fine, but I just didn't get it. You talked about how there was some linkage with the ESEA and the Federal Department of Education, and I'm not sure I quite got that. But what I do hear you saying a couple times is that this is just not a federal program, and it sounds, Dr. McCauley, like you believe this is not, to the extent you believe in the concept of federal overreach, and if you don't, that's fine with me, because I'm one of those who says it's overstated. But this is not, in your opinion, an example of federal overreach.
It is not, in my opinion, Representative Josephson. And one of the things that I think is really critical to keep bringing back into this conversation is the degree to which these new standards are an increase in rigor and an increase in recognizing what it's really going to take for kids to be ready for college and the workplace. So I think we would be in error if we don't talk about our new standards in comparison to our previous standards. We're talking about things like nonfiction text. Our previous standards strongly emphasized fiction. Our new standards strongly emphasize fiction, good literature in the classroom. They also strongly emphasize nonfiction text, which was weak in our old standards. Kids go into college and the workplace, they are reading far more informational text than literature, than fiction. Our previous standards were weak in that area. We are hearing from the university all the time about the remediation rates in our university system. So part of the conversation has to be, in my opinion, the comparison of our new standards to our previous standards. And that these are, again, in my opinion and in the opinion of the educators who worked on developing the standards, a significant improvement from our old grade level expectations.
And I want to clarify, I think the federal government, where they became involved, and I think this put red flags up for people, is the 2 consortiums were put out there with federal funding. That they both got a lot of federal funding up to, I think it's about to end, and so there's some concern about once the federal government quits doing that, if we're part of it, no matter what part we might be, are we going to be, funding it as a portion of that? And then race to the top, and that's one reason I think the state of Alaska didn't take any race to the top, is because you had to adopt the Common Core to qualify for it. So although they weren't at the beginning of it, they kind of muddied the waters because of the basically sticking out some carrots out there, and maybe in hopes to have national standards. I'm not saying they did it for the wrong reasons, but once they started funding the consortium, both consortiums that way, and then the race to the top, you had to adopt the Common Core. You couldn't just have a good program and ask for the money. I think who adopted it got way lost in that. But I wanted to ask, I just wanted to confirm one thing. When we're talking about local control, and now we're talking about curriculum. Okay, and curriculum is the books, the materials you use to teach the standards. If these standards are more rigorous, are not most school districts going to have to not just review the curriculum they currently have, but most likely have to buy new books or supplements to be able to meet these new standards?
Representative Wilson, it is likely that some adjustments regarding curriculum and materials, it's not likely. there will need to be made adjustments to curriculum materials in light of our new standards. How that's done and when it's done is a local decision. One of the things that we are trying to be very clear about is that the first time at which our new standards will be assessed is in 2015. This is not about a race to 2015 to shake everything up so that within a 24-month span of time, kids are proficient with regard to our new standards. It's to make good decisions about what changes need to be made to curriculum and materials, which will vary widely across the state. If for example, a district adopted math materials 5 years ago, and this year is the 6th year on the curriculum review cycle, and math is up again, the timing's perfect. They are now going to consider the adoption of materials in terms of our new standards. And there is no automatic additional requirement there. They would have looked and said, how are our math materials cutting it? Do we need to supplement? Do we need to not use them anymore and adopt new ones? They will be doing that with our new standards. If a district adopted math materials 2 years ago, they are going to need to look at what they adopted and the degree to which they align with our new standards, and they will have some decisions to make around supplementing, around the degree to which they align. So same with curriculum documents, whether it's a scope and sequence or a curriculum map. They'll have to determine what the gaps are and fill those gaps. And in some districts, depending on what they've done, those gaps will be different than in others. But this is not about a rush to have all of that done by the first time our students are assessed. It's to move into the standards. It's to begin transitioning instruction toward them. It's to make good decisions at district levels for the system about what to do. And then when we assess for the first time in 2015, we will have information regarding how our students are doing that forms a new baseline. And then we determine, we and districts and schools determine, okay, now where are we going to go from there?
Do you want to try first or do you want me to go? You go ahead. President Gaddis.
Well, it begs the question, then where does the HSQE stand in this? Because if we're raising our standards, are we raising the HSQE, high school qualifying exam?
Well, under the current statute for the HSGQE, including the intent language that was put in place with it, the HSGQE, I may not get my words exactly right because I haven't looked at that language for some time, but it is prescribed that it must be a test, a basic, essential skills test of basic knowledge. Our new standards aren't basic knowledge. They're much more aspirational than that. So it is actually the time probably to have a discussion. We certainly have it at the department with the commissioner. I wouldn't be surprised if the commissioner has dialogue with the governor. I don't know that. I don't participate in those kinds of conversations. But is that really an exam that fits the new standards? The answer has to be absolutely no, because it's trying to make sure kids have the floor, not that they're ready to go to college. In many cases, districts actually do a very good job of figuring out that. Now, did they always do a good job? I don't know if they always did a good job. I think that test actually has fulfilled something of saying, folks, we've got to make sure these kids at least have those basic skills. But when we look at that test today and look at how many students are denied a diploma because of that alone, and they're not already denied a diploma because they're credit short at the school district, very few students. So all I would describe around that is it's a timely discussion. It is one that we have at the department, but I don't know that we're at a position to say where we should take that in terms of a position. Might be in a different spot within a couple of months, because I think that is a dialogue that certainly is real timely this next legislative session.
But the waiver nor the federal funding is tied to that test.
Representative Wilson, that's correct, because it's completely state statute requirements, and there is no federal statute of a high school graduation qualifying exam. There isn't an exit exam requirement at the federal level. We are one of, I would guess, about somewhere in the range of 23 to 27 states that have some sort of exam exit requirement, but not all states have that.
Okay, and as we move into assessment, I guess I differ with Dr. McCauley, because although there is local control for them to pick and choose what curriculum they want, that is only to the extent that it can match the standards that we have adopted. So, I know there's I don't know where Anchorage is at on it, and I'm sure they're not much, probably where Fairbanks is right now. But Fairbanks, just to keep up, they try to do I believe it's, and I'm trying to hear from the superintendent because I'm probably wrong, but around every 5 or 6 years they try to change, the math curriculum and then the social studies. They kind of have everything on it, and I know I have heard from them that they don't feel there's been any kind of assessment done by districts to go to them and say, how many of your subjects, or just these subjects alone, do you believe cannot meet these standards and you need new curriculum? Because if they're not teaching from the right books to go with the standards, it's going to show up on the assessments, and they're going to get docked whatever point system that we choose to do because the books don't match. So, I guess you're kind of given the impression it's completely local control, and with the research I've done, it's all state control. And we choose, and it's going to sound really bad, and my constituents are going to hate me for this, but the way law has determined it for us and shown us is that the state has chosen to give it to local communities, believing local control is the best. Only if then at the end of the day, through assessments or whatever, the department and the state board determines that criteria that they have to meet. So it's not like they can just do, like a private school, whatever they want. So I don't want to leave this meeting to make people feel like they're going to sit, Fairbanks is going to sit down and look at their math books and say, well, they're close enough. Because you can't be close enough. Am I wrong? They're going to analyze it, but if they're far off, you can't tell me the department isn't going to say anything and say, well, you're close enough and we'll just see how the testing works for you.
Representative Wilson, I certainly don't mean to give the impression that districts can do whatever they want with regard to ensuring alignment with the standards. It is expected that curriculum and materials are aligned with the state's adopted standards. The way districts go back, I also, however, saying that, don't want to imply that the way districts go about having alignment doesn't vary greatly across the state. It varies greatly across the state. I'll just give one example for the sake of illustration. I'm thinking about North Slope Borough School District. Their curriculum is called the Inupiaq Learning Framework. They have a curriculum design process where the drivers are Alaska standards and the Inupiaq Learning Framework, developed locally and exclusively existing in the North Slope Borough School District. From there, with those two pieces of content as the drivers, then they develop unit plans. That is very different than happening anyplace else in the state, and exclusively North Slope. So while yes, curriculum and materials need to be aligned to the standards, there is still a lot of autonomy and a lot of variation across the state with how that looks. And I don't want to underemphasize how varied it is across the state. But yeah, there are also, as we'll get into, with both the assessment pieces here and the accountability pieces, there are expectations. Our new accountability system thankfully allowed us to set those expectations with some parameters, of course, but it's a lot different than adequate yearly progress. But there are expectations and targets for student achievement that are consistent across the state and are based on assessments which are assessing proficiency with our new standards.
So I guess, the question is, did the department go to the districts to the superintendent and ask them why they're doing this review and during some of this public comment of how far off do you think that your curriculum is and how much it would cost you to be able to meet these standards, because it's all connected. And I love choice. Don't get me wrong. If they, because you said the whole thing, they chose to do this part with the standards over here, but you get into these bigger districts, and you just don't kind of have some of that choice. But I'm curious whether we did anything with Fairbanks or Anchorage and say, what's it going to cost to, which ones work, and how much do you think this is going to cost you?
In Les Morris, Deputy Commissioner, there was actually, I think, pretty significant engagement of local districts. Does that mean that they completely agreed that, the costs? I think they had a balance. Do the costs outweigh the benefits, and vice versa in doing this? But as we were working on the engagement of Alaska stakeholders, and particularly when we go with engaged teachers, we actually reach out to all the superintendents to ask them to bring teachers to the table for this work. So clear back when we were developing the standards, which you put new standards in place, it's going to drive curriculum decisions locally, they were involved. Then when we were approaching the completion of those standards, we clearly kept the superintendents involved and in the loop in terms of talking about how different these are, that these really are different. It will require a change in the type of instruction needed, materials needed. The commissioner actually engages superintendents quite regularly, and we actually are hosting a meeting of superintendents, which we do every year this coming Monday. Last year, during the same meeting that we hosted superintendents, we talked about the recent adoption, the kind of work we were going to do to support professional development in the districts through these statewide meetings that we hold twice a year. We've been holding for several years around supporting them on what kind of tools you might need to do the alignment of materials. So again, they were very much in the loop a year ago. In addition, a year ago, we talked about the overall concept of the waiver and actually sought their feedback at that time. So yes, they were involved, but you're also right, it shifts. If they were in a review cycle, the timing might be right, but all of a sudden with the adoption of these standards, they might say, boy, we adopted math 2 years ago, but now it's time to revisit math. There may be some real difficult choices in that. They might say, okay, we're going to review math again this year, which may have some costs. Because that has costs, we were planning to do social studies, but we're not. We're not going to do that. That would be probably the choice I would make if I had have to think about efficiency of resources, because there's nothing driving that change. So yes, the standards are driving the change, but the decision does get to be made locally. But so I wouldn't want to walk away and say there's no cost to it. I would say if they want to keep all their review cycles going the same way and then add these, there'd be added costs. I think many of the districts are saying we're going to have to trade out what we review on this cycle, and therefore the costs might be nearly the same, but the timing would be different of things. Tough decisions that have to be made.
Moving on to assessment?
Yeah, let's, and hopefully